Good to see each of you here today. We've got a couple on cruise, so they'll be gone. They said 2 Sundays.
That's what I heard.
And your mom and dad not doing well? Your mom's not. It's good to see Sharon not working. All right. Congratulations to Chris for his professional engineering license from the state of Georgia. Does that make you a rambling wreck from Georgia Tech?
I already had that.
He was already that. Just makes it more dangerous.
Back when Georgia Tech was in the SEC, that was one of my favorite teams. And still is in some ways. Looking forward to, you can present the budget plans today or tonight?
He's going to do it tonight, I think.
Tonight?
Yes, sir.
Great. Looking forward to that. Brings back memories to see articles with Johnny Ramsey, one of our, you might say, greats from yesteryear. All right, we're on lesson 47, and I am having a little trouble. Seems like the mornings are not conducive for me to be teaching and speaking lately, but we'll get over it, get the best we can. We have been looking at a little bit of Old Testament history just to kind of set the stage, you might say, for a brief introduction to these world religions. We're not going to spend a whole lot of time on this. We're not going to go into a lot of detail. And while there are probably 20, 25, what you might say, major organized religions in the world, there are not very many that's numerically great, you might say. And so we're just going to introduce a couple of them, 3 of them, I believe. But and basically just to show the time frame of how it connects with our study of church history. And we looked at the Old Testament history just to kind of give an idea of who were the descendants of Abraham, how all of those folks were connected, how they were kin, and so forth. And we spent most of our time in what we normally call the patriarchal dispensation, which took us from Adam all the way to Moses. And yet, as far as we're concerned, you know, we go back to the descendants of Noah. Everybody does. When you're talking about kinship and genealogy, we're all related. We all started with the one set of parents, came to Noah, and I guess we're basically from Japheth, the son of Noah. But we just kind of want to see where those folks went, what they did, and so forth, and introduce some ideas. We didn't spend a lot of time on the Mosaical dispensation because it was things that we know. In fact, all of that was things we know. And we'll look at the Christian dispensation more when we get back on track to the Reformation and Restoration. We do know that God took care of his people. We mentioned that the fire by night and the cloud by day, and at the end of 40 years they still had the shoes on their feet and clothes on their back that they left Egypt. A lot of lessons learned. It would really be a great study just to study the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. I painted a chart for a brother years ago. He called it Piddling in the Wilderness. And where he mentioned a lot of things. Brother James Watkins preached a lot of sermons that period of time. You know, the story of Naaman, the Nadab and Abihu, the fiery serpents, the golden calf, just a lot of interesting stories. And it's no wonder Paul said they were written for our learning and admonition, because it does teach us a lot. And what we've already learned is that God has always been the lawgiver. He's never left it up to man to make our laws. In fact, Jeremiah said it's not within man that walketh to direct his own steps. And he's always expected us to obey that law. Now we realize that there are things that don't fall into what you might say the category of faith. Just like Chris is going to present tonight, there are things that take place as a matter of expedience that can be done a number of different ways. The Bible doesn't give us direction, except that we still love one another and care for one another. And so we learned that lesson, and a lot of other lessons. The Old Testament is very interesting study, and while it has never been the focus of my teaching and preaching, I have always enjoyed those who do use a lot of those stories. But anyway, we're going to introduce these three major religions: Hindu, Buddha, and Islam. Now, I basically introduced them because they're the three largest other than Christianity. And also they fall into the time frame that we want to highlight. Just to kind of give us a perspective, we're basically talking about the years between the Testaments. While 500 BC would fall into the near the end of the Old Testament history, which historically, the historical account of the Old Testament, did it end with Ezra? Is Ezra included in the historical accounts? Because the prophets, the major and minor prophets, are things that took place back in the Chronicles and the Kings and things like that. So, say around the time of Ezra, we might have Hinduism introduced. Would that be about right?
I think it might depend on how you identify the beginnings of Hinduism.
Yeah.
It may be like when certain of their so-called holy scriptures were accepted, but they claim Hinduism goes back to the mists of antiquity. Ideas associated with Hinduism go back even earlier.
Yeah, and we're going to mention some of that in a minute, because it's hard to pinpoint the beginning of that movement. But what we have learned, I think, in our study, that by nature, man worships. It's been found that missionaries would go into countries where, where God had never been preached, basically, and they find folks worshiping. When Columbus discovered America, when when folks began to come to America and America was being established, we found the Native Americans, the Indians here, they worshipped various and sundry ways, and they were not all in total agreement, but there was one fact that they did worship, and most referred to the Great Spirit. And there's some interesting folklore in studying some of their stories and beliefs. Their account of the flood is used often to show that it was universal. And there's just a lot of things we learn from that. We also know that man has often created his own God. It might be an idol, it might be a tree, it might be an animal, or himself, mankind, and even the true God. As Paul stood before the folks in Athens and said, "You've got an idol to the unknown God, that's the one I'm going to teach you, the one I'm going to speak to you about." I'm not sure they put that idol there to be to the true God, but The theory is they put that there because they're afraid gods were jealous and they didn't want to leave anybody out. And but yet when Paul looked at the situation, he said, I perceive you're the King James translation says too superstitious. That word can be translated religious. And I believe the American Standard says religious. Basically meaning you've got too many gods. I don't think it's saying, you're too religious, per se. But there again, there's a vast difference between religion and Christianity. And so, I think what he was trying to point out to them, you've got too many gods. You're worshiping too many gods. We showed this chart early on when we first introduced this lesson about 4 or 5 lessons ago, but we'll just bring it to your remembrance. And these figures could vary a few percentage points because they change. But basically, Christianity represents about 1/3 of the world's religion. Sad to say, we're not really gaining ground. Now this includes everybody that would basically accept Jesus Christ as the Messiah. It does not, at this point, make a distinction between the denominations and the church. So, you see how the influence of Christ, you might say, has permeated the world and is still the largest group. It's by far the largest group in America. I read somewhere where Christianity was the 3rd largest religion in India. India has always been kind of a religious group of people. There's a lot of stories you hear from missionaries about India. We heard from the Amos, Matt and David Amos, last year on their Mission Emphasis Sunday, where they talked about India. And there's so many missionaries that go to India because they seem to have a lot of success there. And it's interesting. And we're going to mention that again when we talk about the obscurity of the church. The rest of the population, when you move away from the top, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam, that makes up about 75%. The rest of it is divided into the non-religious group that you would call atheist and agnostic, and then all the others lumped together. Included in this 10% would be Judaism, would be some of the Far East religions that we read about now and then, Japan's national religion, Korea's national religion. There's just a lot of religions out there. And this is not really a study of all the world's religions. As again, I say, it's just to kind of introduce. So let's look at what is called the oldest and the 3rd largest of the world religions. Of course, since Judaism is listed in the list of world religions, it would be older than Hinduism, although, as Philip's already mentioned, it's hard to find a beginning point of Hinduism. You can't find a founder. You can't find, when they say this is actually where it began, because it's kind of a way of life.
Another problem is in our sources, like encyclopedias and so on. If they're written from a liberal modernist perspective, they believe that Judaism started like about 400 BC, about the time of Ezra. Yeah. That's when Judaism began. They reject the accounts of Moses and so on. Right. So that's another reason they might say that. So you have to kind of consider what the source is that says that, you know.
Right. Yeah, they don't claim, as far as I know, they don't claim a founder. Say, so-and-so is the founder of Hinduism. And I can't find where they actually say this is the beginning point. Because when things evolve and when ideas grow, it's kind of hard to say, when did the idea first come about? Who had that idea first? Because, people talk, people exchange ideas and so forth. So, Hinduism falls into that category. Well, of course, I already mentioned Christianity's, those that believe in Christ, is the largest. Islam and Buddhism are number 2 and 4. So Hinduism is the 3rd largest. Okay. All right, let's just look at a couple of things. Since it has no specific founder, it's hard to trace its origin, it's hard to trace its history, and it's very unique in many ways because it's not really just a single religion. Philip, I might be wrong about this, but it kind of reminds me of the Unitarianism movement today. Who's the founder of Unitarianism? Who's the founder of, what's the group I'm thinking about? Anyway, they say, we don't accept anything we can't prove logically. Basically it's a philosophy, the way I look at it. Is that the way you would look at that? Unitarianism is sort of a philosophy.
Well, Unitarianism has been around for a long time.
Yeah.
God is one.
Right.
But the Unitarian Church, they came about, there were heresy of Socinius and others back in the 16th century maybe, but they came to the United States. In Great Britain, they flourished along about the 18th and 19th century.
Yeah.
And they don't, like you said, they don't believe in anything. And you can't pin them down on anything. It's just watery, fluid ideas about everything.
And I kind of equate similarity here, in that idea, because it's just what you might say, a compilation of a lot of philosophy. The way we live, the way we think. And there's some things mentioned that you probably can't deny. Let's just look at a few of the things that we find. It embraces many religious ideas, and sometimes just referred to as a way of life, or family of religions, as opposed to just a single organized religion. It's very difficult. It has its roots, again, in India and in the surrounding areas. I think Indonesia is one of the largest populated areas as far as percentage goes. And I guess those folks would have been descendants of Cush, Ham's son, Noah's grandson. Not all together, because there's some exchange there.
I read that some believe there were early inhabitants. I believe they were called the Dravidians, dark-skinned people in what we call the subcontinent or India. Early inhabitants that would have probably, like you say, been the sons of Ham, descendants of Ham in some way. And they had their idolatrous views, but that's not necessarily Hinduism today. But Hinduism came from the sons of Japheth, the Aryans out of Middle Europe, the steppes of Europe. They came over into Persia first and settled and gave a lot of ideas. Then they migrated into, they were lighter-skinned people, and migrated to India and enslaved the darker-skinned Dravidians and superimposed their beliefs they had brought from the sons of Japheth. And that's where what we know of often is Hindu, although, like you say, Hinduism is anything. Worship of these little idols, home idols, and belief in that there is everything is God and God is everything. It's just a hodgepodge of ideas.
Yeah.
But those ideas we find in Greece too, like you say. It's hard to know where the
a lot of Greek philosophies in some of them. They have, in many cases, a single deity known as, I don't know how to pronounce that, Brian, man. How do you pronounce that?
I say Brahman.
Brahman. But then they still recognize other gods and goddesses. They kind of use the expression, that some people, all roads lead to Rome. There are multiple paths, many ways, many different ways, and they don't necessarily have a single way. And also, fundamental principles is the idea that people's actions and thoughts directly determine their current life and future lives. Well, part of that we recognize. I mean, what you think, you may not be what you think you are, but what you think you are, It
upsets me to no end. I think I've mentioned this before. I'm sorry, it's my pet peeve that modern Americans like to talk about bad karma. That's their foolish idea they get, which is ancient Greek views of fate. It's karma. Everything works against me. I can't help it. I'm tired of a Christian nation thinking in terms of karma, because that's a completely un-Christian idea,
Right.
the way they look at it.
And when they talk about future lives, are they talking about another life or just down the road?
They're talking about reincarnation into a different being, whether you're an ant or a cow or whatever.
That's what I got from it.
I think that's, it seems like years ago there used to be a saying that I heard a lot, what goes around comes around. I mean, I think that's really the idea. I don't know that people, subscribe to it. I think they use maybe karma in that kind of way, that, they got what they deserve. But it's not a good idea to, it's kind of like, in movies we have the ideas of, the reincarnation and, what is it? Well, I'm thinking about movies like Star Wars, the Force and that kind of thing. Although I enjoy it, it's kind of entrenching these concepts of, everybody is everything and God is everyone and everyone's God kind of idea. So it may not be explicitly teaching.
Now, do they believe? See, I don't know a whole lot about this. I just know what to read. I've never been to practice. But when they talk about coming back in another life, are they talking about coming back as another human being, or maybe as some other animal?
Well, it depends on how you live. If you've got a lot of good karma, you might come back as a superior human being. But if you do bad stuff, even though that's contradictory, they're very contradictory, because they can't define good and evil in any standard term. If you do bad stuff, you might come back as an ant or a cow. That's why they won't eat cows. They're sacred, because it might be an ancestor.
Yeah, they revere all living creatures and consider the cow a sacred animal. Now, there's a lot of disagreement among their own writings, because sometimes people say they worship cows. They say we don't worship cows, but we honor them and revere them and respect them for a number of reasons, they say.
Well, since we're on the subject, just to kind of flesh it out a little bit more, the idea of karma, is it more of a works-based righteousness concept? I mean,
I think karma is very impersonal. You see, they took a legitimate idea that there's a personal God who will reward good and evil. Now that's true. They twisted that and turned it into an impersonal God and an impersonal force of a law that cannot be changed. You cannot petition karma to make your life better or ask for forgiveness like you can of the God of heaven. That's impossible. It's an automatic thing. It's set in the circuitry. It can never be changed, and you're caught on this endless cycle or wheel of karma, and you can never get out of it. It's an endless cycle of sorrow. Sometimes life's better, but you will never quit being reincarnated. It goes on forever. There was no beginning. There is no end.
So are they saying you get what you deserve? What comes around, what goes around comes around.
But I mean, can't you control it to a certain extent by your actions, or?
We see there's where the contradiction lies in Hinduism, because they do try to say, yeah, if you do bad things in life, if you're a bad person, you live in ignorance, you get bad karma, you add to your bad karma. But it's contradictory, because in the end they say there is no such thing as right and wrong. Yeah. Because whatever is right, because whatever is Brahman. Everything that happens, including every action, from the axe murder to the child molester, Brahman is doing it. So in the end, you can't criticize whatever is, it just is, and there's no right and wrong. Yeah. But humans can't live that way. That's a twisted philosophy. Deep down, they know there's such things right and wrong.
Would they use, like, the story of Joseph, for example, who was a deceiver? You know, he deceived his brother and his father. Then later he was deceived. And, you know, would they use stories like that in talking about karma, or?
Well, the Bible does teach, you know, you reap what you sow.
Right.
But their idea is a lot, but because we reap what we sow because a personal God wills it that way.
Yeah.
But their idea is there is no personal God, and they might use that as an illustration, but
yeah.
It's a very strong view of fate and predestination.
I read somewhere where they talk. I was wondering about the cow. You know, who's the famous holy cow? Is that the Simpsons or somebody? Anyway, and you hear things now and then like sacred cows, you know, and stuff. But I read an article where they said, you know, it was written by somebody who was in this philosophy. Said we don't worship cows. We honor and respect them. And then they went on to describe a cow. They give more than they take, they said, you know. They just keep on giving milk, and they're just very important person. And most of them are vegetarians anyway.
Well, and I wonder how much of this is our Western imposition of our thinking process on this Eastern mysticism stuff, because I think about the Beatles, you know, they have a song where they say, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. Isn't that the lyrics of one of their songs? But I mean, weren't they, I mean, they were very heavily involved at some point in this Eastern mysticism. So I wonder if they're taking, you know, Christian upbringings and molding this Eastern mysticism, which at the root of it is, I mean, there is no core. I mean, it's just kind of, you know, wishy-washy. But maybe they're trying to pluck some meaning out of it and saying, kind of the way that, you know, most people would interpret karma as being kind of, you know, what you put out there into the world is what you're going to get back. You know. So I kind of wonder if that's kind of, we're putting our happy Christian ethos on a Eastern mysticism kind of night.
That's probably what the New Age movement, it used to be called that, now it's humanism. That's what it does.
And you know, it's like saying, even in our group, we might sit around and say, that's a good idea. Well, some might think it is, some might think it's not, and some might repeat it, but it doesn't make it cardinal doctrine, you know.
And I'm sorry, but I'm just, you know, and maybe ultimately that's at the core of this, because, you know, if you do have a religion like that, and they really don't have ultimately, you know, Jehovah God, an ultimate arbiter of right and wrong, whereas we do. And so when we think about things like justice and rightness and goodness, we do still have that core belief that there is an ultimate, you know, right and wrong rule maker, whereas they don't have that. And so, you know, we're kind of standing on firm ground, and we're trying to make these ideas make sense to us, and yet to them, it's all meaningless. So it doesn't really matter ultimately.
It's kind of open-ended. You know? Well, and I guess if you don't have a standard by which you determine is this right or is this wrong, then what would be right or what would be wrong? You know, it's just. Of course, I see a little bit of that thinking in some of our liberal brethren. You know?
they're not consistent about it, but
Right.
when it's convenient, they like that.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, isn't that where situational ethics comes in?
And especially the ones that, say, like you've been talking about, some of the Bible's inspired, some of it's not, then you kind of pick and choose. Once you remove your standard and go through that door, what's going to keep you from doing anything?
Matt, I'm sorry to interrupt, but you got us on something we're all interested in. I've been floating a theory, and I wanted to test it in this class. It may be wrong, but after studying this for a long time, especially the idea of pantheism, that everything is God and God is everything,
Yeah.
I've come to the conclusion that pantheism is really atheism. Now, I know they would deny that. They would balk at the idea, but if they would hear me out, I'd explain it is really atheism that just personifies the world of nature. It's qualitatively not different from atheism. There's another view called panentheism, which is different from atheism, but they're pantheists. So they basically are denying that you can't say Brahman is God in this. It would not be. We wouldn't be communicating. They just say Brahman is just everything that is.
Well, the idea of theism is a supernatural being, whereas in pantheism, there is nothing above nature. It's not supernatural. It's nothing but natural.
Exactly.
Yeah, and that explains sometimes why you look at what somebody says, say, how in the world can a sane thinking person think that? It's because they've thought through, they've accepted that kind of, what you might say, foundation. And once they believe that foundation, then they can build what they want to on it.
When I was in high school, this would have been kind of a theoretical, irrelevant discussion, chasing rabbits, but not anymore, because you go down to the local street corner, local convenience store. Hinduism is all in this country. Their temples are built, ashrams, I think, everywhere.
Well, and I mentioned earlier about the cow, and they do respect. It says they respect the animals, but God had some laws about not eating some animals, but it wasn't because they were sacred. It's because it wouldn't be good for you to eat it, that type of thing. But you remember he told Peter, arise, kill and eat. They were all manner of four-footed beasts and so forth. So, it would be contrary to the Bible to say you can't eat meat, because we know that God was okay with that. And, if you don't want to eat meat, that's your business, but you don't make it a spiritual law. Okay, let's see where we are. I've already said that. Okay. I read where one of the thoughts of Hinduism is Atman, or the belief of the soul. It says living creatures have a soul, and they're part of the supreme soul, and the goal is to achieve moksha, or salvation, which ends the cycle of rebirths and becomes part of the absolute soul. I didn't really understand what they were saying.
They don't either. I don't mean to be smart aleck about it. But it's that idea that you just get absorbed back into Brahman. Yeah. But you're not really ever not absorbed. You're always a part of it. See, it's totally contradictory. But they love contradictions. They think it's more.
And I think that leads to this continuous cycle of life, death, and reincarnation and karma, the universal law of cause and effect. I guess that kind of thinking leads to this kind of thinking, like I said, once you open the door. Even today, when we look at the changes that have been brought about in the church, there's places where you stop. Because if you open that door and go through it, then you've removed restriction that the Bible might restrict. For example, I'll use this example. In the role of women in the church, certainly there's many things and many important things for women in the church. If it were not for the women in most congregations, there wouldn't be anything going on anyway. But God chose, and He gave us the reasons why, male leadership. But now and then people will bring up things, well, why can't women serve the Lord's table? Would it be wrong for a woman to pass the plate? And some have said, well, women do pass the plate. You know, sometimes Jane passes it to me when she's sitting by her. And then they say, well, could she stand up and turn around and hand the guy behind her and so forth? But here's the thing. When you open the door and you put women in a perceived leadership role, you've opened a door that says, well, if they can do that, they can do this. And so when you go through that door, then you've crossed the threshold of biblical authority. And so there's some things you don't do because, while it might be considered a gray area by some people, it's the, what you might say, the stopgap. It's where you need to stop, because if you go beyond that, then you've opened a door you can't close. I mean, that's the way I look at it.
I agree. That's a good point to make.
I'm not sure how they pronounce that word. I think the H is silent, and I think the A has an E sound, so it'd be like drama, which is a code of living that emphasizes good conduct and morality. Well, certainly we can't deny that it's important.
Don't mention law.
But there again, we can't also envelop it around all of this philosophy.
So it's karma and dharma? So it's karma and dharma?
Evil twins.
Is that, I thought that was a show on TV or something.
Dharma was the name of a company on Lost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
Yeah, Dharma and Greg is TV.
and there again, that somebody throwed that in, and they said, "Well, that sounds good. We'll," but not there again. Too, it's kind of like members of denominations. You might say, "You're a member of that denomination, so here's what you believe." Well, that's not necessarily so. You know, there are members of a particular denomination who do not believe all the doctrine of that denomination.
Yeah, that's the problem. If somebody says, I'm a Hindu, you still don't know what they believe.
Right.
Because the spectrum ranges from their real cerebral-minded or heady philosophers who believe in Vedanta, pantheism, all the way down to the average person that worships little gods or statues and they think they're alive. So they all call it Hinduism, but you can't peg it down. It's like nailing Jello to the wall.
Okay, and it's also, and it's understandable that it's closely related to many of these other Eastern religions, because that's where they got their ideas to start with. The supposed founder of Buddhism was a Hindu, so they certainly carry a lot of these philosophies into their religions, although the main difference between these others and, say, Hinduism is they do have, say, a founder, and they do have a main object of worship and so forth. That's kind of what I see as the difference in that. I think
Hey, Leroy, are you gonna? I just was curious. I've been interested in Sikhism. Are you going to talk about Sikhism, or is Sikhism, is that something you're going to talk about, or are you just mentioning it in passing?
Deism.
Sikhism.
Sikhism.
What? Yeah, you just mentioned Sikhism. Is that all? Were you going to elaborate on that at all, or?
Let me see.
Back up. Right after Buddhism.
Yeah.
I don't know if that was all you wanted to say on it. Or
Yeah, I was just showing that some of these other Eastern religions have some of this same philosophy, you know.
The reason I was interested because I didn't know a lot about Sikhism, but the one thing I did find interesting was that they say that there's one God. They have that idea, at least, as opposed to the other.
Well, a lot of religions aren't monotheistic, but their one God is not our one God, you know. But I mean, there are some religions that even call their God by their language. But the God they describe is not the God of the Bible. And I mean, I don't know. Who did the Indians think the Great Spirit was, you know?
Well, from what I've read, because I thought, well, I wonder if they were influenced by Christianity, the founder of Sikhism, but I don't think that's it. I think he actually had some Muslim influence.
Yeah.
And so I think that was maybe the core of it. But
well,
anyway,
there's certainly some Muslim influence in some of these other religions. And who's to say? I mean, say here's the person, I'm Hindu. But then you teach him about the one God, and you convert him to that idea. So he says, okay, there's one God. But he doesn't remove his beliefs. You know, he still kind of believes what he's always believed. He can say, well, yeah, there's one God, but that doesn't keep me from believing all of these things. And that's why the more I read about it, the more confused I got, so I quit reading. They have a symbol called the Sawachi or something.
Swastika.
But it later became the, well, I'm losing it.
Go back.
Yeah.
The swastika is what the.
That became the Nazi symbol,
yeah,
so
Nazi.
I guess they don't like to use that much anymore or something. I don't know. I didn't even know that. I ran across it in some article I was reading. And I don't really know what the symbols mean, what they stand for. Are you familiar with that?
Well, not much. The swastika, the Germans had these idealized views about the Aryan race, and they had found Aryans who had gone into places like Persia and India, so-called Aryans. They associated with them as being Caucasian or Caucasoid type peoples, and they saw one of the ancient symbols of the swastika, so they adopted it. And the Om, I didn't realize it was a symbol. It's more of the Om. They think they can get one with God when they say that long enough. Om.
Om.
Om. You gotta say it longer than that. Om. You gotta hold your breath and then say it a long time.
Yeah.
You're more holy if you can do it.
I looked at it and I said, oh me.
I'm going to have to make sure I back up this video for when YouTube takes it down because of the swastika on it. I said I'm going to have to make a backup of this video in case YouTube takes it down because there's a swastika on the screen there.
Yeah, I guess so. I can do that.
Yeah, because that symbol never existed, right?
Yeah.
Well, a preacher talking about it. I mean, we're going to get swarmed by SWAT officers here in a bit.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Well, it's hard sometimes to show something that, I understand. Anyway, that's basically what I had decided to introduce as far as Hinduism is concerned. And I don't know any more about it now than I did.
You're brave. A long time ago, I was teaching a class in Alabama, and I said, let's talk about the world's religions. For example, I want to talk about what the Hindu believes. And somebody in class said, brother, what's a Hindu? And the deacon said, lays eggs. That's as far as we got with that discussion.
Yeah, that's probably true. Well, anyway, we'll stop there. Does anybody have any other comment they want to make?
It just seems to me like the, Hinduism and all these other isms that have the idea of the kind of the pantheism. I mean, it just seems like it's another extension of like the Greek and the Roman pantheon of gods. And
well, flip the light on, Betty, when you. you can't remove the influence of Greek philosophy from that era of time. I mean, there's a lot of gods and ideas. I mean, it's just it'd take forever to go through it, you know.
It seems like maybe it's just the final form or the complete devolution of
Right.
what had transpired from the beginning, which was the one God, and then people started
Yeah.
making many gods, and then all of a sudden now it's just this very thin smear of complete and utter everything's a god.
One of the things historians are coming to see, although it used to be they used to hold the contrary view back in the 19th century, they have come to see that as far back as we can study religious ideas among ancient cultures, the farther back you go, the closer you get to monotheism in every culture that we have any knowledge of, including American Indians or Native Americans and Chinese. But of course, over the centuries and millennia, like Chris was saying, they corrupted that idea into all these philosophies. And the reason it makes sense biblically why earlier they believed in the high God, the one high God they often would call him, and it came from Shem, Ham, and Japheth and their descendants. They went off, migrated to different areas, and they took that knowledge with them, even though men began to hide from God and make up lesser gods that they could manage and control. They couldn't quite get out of their consciousness the idea of the one high God.
Yeah. Well, what was it? Derby and Lystra, somewhere where the folks thought that Paul and Silas were Greek gods. So on one of their mission trips, or was it Paul and Barnabas?
Paul and Barnabas.
Paul and Barnabas. Which showed again the strong influence of Greek philosophy. And we mentioned India. I think India is mentioned in the Old Testament a couple of times, maybe in the book of Esther.
Persia.
Mentioned from India to here, and
Persia is Esther.
yeah, but I mean the word India appears in the English translation once or twice, but it's only just showing locale, kind of like the Queen of Sheba, something like that, where she came from. Well, anyway, appreciate your comments and your input. I learn a lot when you speak because, if you just listen to yourself, you don't really increase your knowledge. You just know what you already know. So I appreciate always the things that you